Hello, everybody. I will share some slides with you and introduce myself as a part of those slides. But my name is Dr. Aaron Davis, joining you from Adelaide in Australia tonight. Hopefully you can see these slides. The title of my presentation is very unoriginal because it's the name of the project that I'm going to spend this presentation talking about, which is the Neuroscience Optimized Virtual Environments Living Lab, a project I've been part of for the past 4 or 5 years now, with a very large group of partners, as you can get a bit of a sense of from this opening slide. Before I do get underway, I would like to acknowledge that I am living and working, and right now I'm on the unceded lands of the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains, as a group of Aboriginal people from the part of Australia I am from. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who are joining us and pay respect to the relationship First Nations people have with their country globally. So as I said, my name is Aaron Davis. You can see from the list of post-nominals that I've had quite a long time in universities collecting degrees. I actually started as a classical clarinetist and a musician before moving into architecture and then eventually finding my way toward a PhD. My key area of interest is around our ways of designing, so the processes and the value of co-design in particular, or co-creation or co-production, or whatever you would like to call it, depending on which part of the world you are coming from. And I work predominantly in healthcare, whether that's healthcare environments, healthcare services, healthcare systems, or public health type projects. That's one of the realities of academic research work, is that we need to go a little bit where the funding is, but I find health is a very, very rewarding area to be doing my research and practice within. So in this presentation, I've thrown together 5 elements to talk you through, which will be reasonably rapid fire to hopefully give a bit of time for some questions at the end. If anybody is struggling with my accent, please do just pop something in the chat or put your hand up to say, please speak more slowly or something like that. I know the Australian accent can be a little bit challenging for some people. But we'll start with an introduction to the NOVELL project. Then I've got a few slides I've put together which I think are useful to go through because they really begin to unpack what it means to be a designer working in health and how we are perhaps coming from a slightly different perspective to a lot of the people that we are working with. Then I'll go back to the main project to talk about how the Neuroscience Optimized Virtual Environments Living Lab has operated, both in terms of where we started and how we ended up evaluating what we had created, and then summarize with 3 key takeaways that I think are very important for anybody, whether you are from an architecture background or a design discipline or any other discipline working within health. So the Neuroscience Optimized Virtual Environments Living Lab, or NOVELL, which is a much easier way to say, has a range of academic and industry partners, as well as a very interesting advisory board. You may see a few US-based names there that you might recognize. Some pretty big hitters in the healthcare design space have been steering this project. And then we have a team of local researchers across Australia that have been working on this project for around 4 or 5 years now. Really trying to reimagine and redesign stroke rehabilitation environments. So stroke and rehabilitation environments, in particular subacute care, has been the focus of this project, principally because it's a bit of a canary in the coal mine for healthcare design. The reason I say that is because people who have stroke spend a lot of time in hospital. So with a lot of acute conditions, we measure length of stay in hours or perhaps days, whereas in stroke, we're measuring length of stay in months or at least weeks. So people spend a lot of time in these hospitals. There's also a really interesting team-based and interdisciplinary care model that's required to work with people post-stroke. And we know there's a lot of evidence about the role that the environment plays in either accelerating or decelerating people's recovery from stroke and their journey through rehabilitation. So environments are being recognised as a very important contributor when we are dealing with people post-stroke. What we know about existing stroke rehabilitation environments is that they are not fit for purpose. Patients are inactive and spend a lot of time alone. This is something that we want when we're dealing with other acute health conditions, but when we're dealing with stroke, we want people getting up and out of their bed, leaving their bedrooms, and getting out, socializing, walking around, practicing conversation with other people. Because people are so isolated, they develop depression, they become very bored, they become very tired, and we are constantly searching for ways to engage people and motivate people to want to do things. A lot of the challenge is that rehabilitation facilities are very rarely purpose-built. They're very often an adapted ward from another part of a hospital. So trying to imagine a hospital that's been designed to keep people in their beds ready for the doctor to come past, and try and then switch that to accommodate a service based on people moving around all of the time and getting out of bed as much as possible, it really does not work very well. So this project aimed firstly to create strong partnerships between all of the stakeholders involved. So between governments, healthcare companies, both private and public, industry, which is our architecture partners, as well as a few other healthcare partners, academics like myself, and people with lived experience of stroke rehabilitation. We aim to develop new technologies, educational approaches, and research opportunities to generate a new and rigorous design process, which you will have a little bit of a taste of in this presentation, and to eventually begin to optimize stroke rehabilitation services and environments through the design of a virtual or virtual reality hospital. We haven't yet been funded to build one of these rehab wards, but we are hoping over the next decade or so to progress this. So a key tenet of the project has been about bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders. Many of you may have heard of the term living lab before. Essentially, it boils down to bringing together industry, research, government, and people with lived experience as a part of the design process. In this project, we worked through a very standard design research process, although we spent a lot of time explaining what design research meant to people who were from a more medical background or a clinical background, where we started with a lot of concept design and throwing a lot of ideas around, moving into a prototyping phase and then an evaluation phase at the end of the project. The project kicked off just before the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to one of my first major pieces of research to come out of this project, which was around the ways that we engage with people. So in a paper published in 2021, but developed through the experience of 2020, we made a case for exploring how a spatiotemporal mapping of our design practices could enable new opportunities for people to participate. So you may be very familiar with design meetings where we get together at the same time in the same space. And through COVID and what we're doing right now, we're at the same time in different spaces. But extending this into the other quadrants, we also explored opportunities to work with people at different times and in different spaces, as well as at different times, but in the same space. And I'll give you a few examples of these, but they're four really interesting ways of thinking about how we might collaborate with our stakeholder groups. So our top right quadrant, our same time, different space. Many of you have been part of things. You're doing one right now, where we are gathering together using Miro or other technologies to get people to engage in online workshops. But as a part of developing these online workshops, we also looked at how we could take the activities that we were developing. So here, I created a deck of cards with 99 potential programs, types of building programs that could be possible, and then asked people to sort them around what would be appropriate to have near or far away from a subacute rehabilitation facility. And we designed these so that each of the activities in our live workshop sessions could also be undertaken asynchronously, so that people who weren't able to participate in a 2.5, 3 hour long online session, which is quite a lot of the stroke survivor community, given the challenges with cognitive load and fatigue, we were able to give people opportunities to go through these activities in their own time and then still contribute to the larger project work. Some of our same space but different time work involved the creation of an online co-researcher hub where we put challenges out for people to contribute, a little bit of a crowdsourcing model, which we were trying to get away from but didn't do particularly successfully, as well as some face-to-face drop-in environments where we would open up a space for a few days at a time and allow people to come past at a time that suited them and to spend as little or as much time as they wished, chatting with us, making their contributions to what was going on in the project. We, of course, also ran some typical face-to-face workshops, which were very important in terms of building a lot of the trust and building a lot of value for a lot of our participants as well, and became incredibly important when we were doing our evaluations because we were reliant on virtual reality headsets and conversational approaches as a part of our evaluations. We also experimented a lot with how we could blend these together. So this is some images from our design esquisses or our design sprints, which were a part of the prototyping phase, where we were working with some very large tech-enabled rooms to collaborate between online and face-to-face participants and using some very large Miro boards as collaborative shared experimentation spaces for the design process. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the type of work we've been doing. I want to step away for a moment just to go through a bit of what drives me as a designer working in healthcare, in the hope that this might spark some recognition in you of similar things you might have thought about along the way as well. So typically when I talk to people about the work that I do, people are very confused because what is an architect doing working in healthcare? Sure, you can design a hospital, but why are you getting involved in the service design or all of the other types of design as well? Surely designers spend time using post-it notes and drawing nice pictures is usually the conversation. But I think that's a really powerful role that designers can play in not just sticking to doing the architecture or doing the blueprints or doing the drawings, but getting involved more holistically in thinking about the challenges that we are working on. This is a quick list I put together of the people I've worked with over the past couple of years. It's not all healthcare. There's a few great terms. I still struggle to pronounce the pharmacokineticists and the craniomaxillofacial surgeons, but architects, I think, can work with people across a really wide range of areas because of the unique skills that we are bringing. So what are those skills? This is a slide I always put up and ask people if they know who it is. Very rarely do people actually know this guy. But once I put up a quote, most people would recognize that this is Henry Ford. And I like this quote because it illustrates a big challenge that we have in design in that we often ask the wrong questions. And going to people and asking what they want is usually going to be the wrong question, whether that is about a mode of transport or it's about a hospital design. We need to ask people different questions. So what are you trying to achieve is a much better question than what do you want? What are you trying to achieve will get from New York to Boston more quickly. What do you want will get you a faster horse. Another great thinker, Albert Einstein, I always put him up to just illustrate the role of imagination, creativity, and the things that we're really good at as designers. Because we can step outside of the known and give birth, as he says, to evolution. We can come up with new ideas by going through a lot of our designerly processes. An easier way to explain that is that we need different thinking from what we use when we create our problems. But I think it's summed up really well by this guy who's a business academic who writes that it's often our expertise and our experience, the things that we know to be right and that work, that prevent us from coming up with something truly new. So David Burkus wrote this in 2013. And I think this is critical as soon as you are thinking about working with healthcare professionals. because they are so ingrained in the response of the things that are right. They know they work, they know it is the answer, and it can be very challenging for someone from a more scientific background to accept a designerly way of knowing or a designerly way of exploring questions, which is not based on finding the one right answer, but based on finding many right answers. So in terms of the role of design, I often also use this diagram, which comes from Elizabeth Sanders and PJ Stappers. This was part of their convivial toolbox that they published in 2012. And they talk about different types of knowledge that we can access as a part of a collaborative process. And so we can think of explicit knowledge as asking people a question or doing a survey, conducting interviews or running focus groups. And if I ask you to think about if I was to interview and ask you what you'd eaten in the past week, I will get one set of responses about your diet, which is based on your explicit knowledge of that. If I then do some observational studies of you and I actually monitor what you eat for a week, chances are I'm going to get quite a different answer from what you self-report, because it will be more of the observable or implicit knowledge. And what Sanders and Stappers argue is that through creative practices, through design processes that we're all familiar with, we're actually able to access a different type of knowledge again, which is tacit, latent, and cultural knowledge. So by going through design-based activities or creative activities, we can add to these other forms of research as a part of projects, not replace them, but add to them to come up with some really interesting new ideas that are based on accessing this tacit and latent knowledge that people are holding that is usually incredibly difficult to access. So what does this mean for healthcare design? Well, if I come back to an example, in healthcare design, our buildings are very expensive. So the thing that the Palazzo in Las Vegas and the Shard in London have in common is that they both cost $1.9 billion. They're very expensive buildings. But a hospital in my city, where I'm from, in Adelaide, South Australia, costs $2.1 billion. So a hospital costs more than the Palazzo in Vegas and more than the Shard in London. So these are incredibly expensive buildings that we need to get right. But they're also very, very complex. So our health care environments have people in them. They have a whole lot of complexity around planning and structures and engineering and the place. And then there's a whole lot of processes as well. So the services and all of these things are interlapping. They're then mediated by a layer of technology, usually, that is weaving in and out of all of these things. Now, if you approach a healthcare design challenge by going to a doctor or going to a nurse, you will find that they can come and they can tell you what is the right answer for the hospital, or what is the right answer for the ward that you're designing, or the bedroom that you're designing, or whatever it is that you have been set the challenge of. So you think, wonderful, they applied logic and reason and they gave you the answer. But if you then go to a different person, they will apply their logic and their reason. So instead of going to the surgeon, now we've gone to the perioperative surgical nurse. They've applied logic and reason, and they've given you their answer. We go to a few more people. We go to a patient representative. They apply logic and reason, and they will give you an answer. But the problem is, each of these answers contradicts all the other answers. So we cannot use logic and reason to arrive at what is the best hospital design. That's really, really problematic, and why a lot of time when we are dealing with healthcare, we end up in really muddy waters because we are trying to negotiate between competing interests. It's a little bit easier when you are in school designing some theoretical hospitals or theoretical environments, because you only really need to follow the logic and reason of your professor. But when you're out designing with really complex groups of stakeholders, there's a whole lot more logic and reason being applied and a whole lot more answers that are all contradictory. So how can this be? Well, Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist first and foremost, but also a philosopher and a part-time neuroscientist, I would say. And his theory relies on understanding the brain in terms of the two hemispheres. I'd recommend having a read of his stuff if you are interested in neuroscience and philosophy. But essentially, he argues that our left brain is responsible for a reductionist way of thinking, which is that we need to break things down into ever smaller parts. And if we can just understand all the parts, then we understand everything. So this is what the scientific method is largely based on and what our ideas of causation are based on. Then he argues the right brain, which is about how we comprehend the world, is structured around a holistic reading. So reading a whole rather than the sum of its parts. And this is how we can understand that saying of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, because it is quite different to the sum of its parts. So one of the differentiations that Professor McGilchrist makes is that we typically define things in the right brain by what things are not rather than by what things are. So here I've used the example of good architecture is not rather than good architecture is, because it's much easier for us to describe what good architecture is not than what it is. Equally, things like jazz music is one example he uses. We can't necessarily define exactly what jazz is, but we can set a set of rules or boundary conditions that tell us what jazz fits within as a field. A slightly simpler version of this same idea comes from Isaiah Berlin, a little bit older, as a philosopher and political theorist, who divides people onto a spectrum between the hedgehog, who likes to break everything down and understand everything by very small parts, bit of that left brain thinking, and looks for everything to make sense together. So a hedgehog-based thinking approach will seek consistency, clarity, logic, reason, and rationality, while the fox, on the other hand, is comfortable with knowing many small things that are contradictory. Most people who find their way into architecture, design, art, creative practices tend to be more comfortable thinking as a fox and dealing with complexity and dealing with dissonance between some of the information sources that they are dealing with. But many of the people we collaborate with when we are working on healthcare projects prefer to think more like a hedgehog. So both Professor McGilchrist and Isaiah Berlin give some useful framings, I think, when we come back to think about our way of designing in healthcare projects. So returning back to the NOVELL project to show you sort of what this looks like when it plays out in practice, instead of starting with measuring things and starting with data and starting with cause and effect type relationships, in this project, we started with setting what we value. So we started by defining 4 fundamental objectives for inpatient stroke rehabilitation facilities. And then beneath those, we worked with our very large stakeholder groups to arrive at 19 means objectives. So the means objectives are our ways of achieving our fundamental objectives. So the theory is if we do all of the things in our means objectives, we will achieve efficiency, emotional well-being, safety, and a balance of activity and rest for our patients. I'll give you some examples of those means objectives very shortly. But these are all interconnected things. And this diagram just shows sort of how these means objectives, which are things like maximizing sight lines, minimizing manual handling, maximizing access to positive and stimulating environments, then map onto our fundamental objectives of what we're trying to achieve through our design. As a part of our process, we arrived at 8 prioritized means objectives because 19 is too many to design for. So we worked again with our stakeholder groups to define which are the top 8 that we should be focusing on first. And these were maximizing the versatility of the space. And you can see if you zoom in a little bit, there is a much longer description of these as well. maximizing access to positive and stimulating environments, incorporating and supporting adequate technology, maximizing outdoor and green space, maximizing personal control over the space, maximizing the legibility and understandability or readability of the space, maximizing accessibility, and maximizing sightlines and visibility were prioritized to be the top 8. So once we had these, we were able to move into a design phase based on the premise of design a hospital ward or bedroom that achieves these 8 things. So we had some architecture firms, Jacobs and McBride Charles Ryan in particular. Shari, who was your previous speaker, was working at Jacobs at the time. I think she still is. And also Vivid Wayfinding, together with some academic leads, to design some physical built environments. We had JP Saar, who is a occupational therapist, led the process of care design. With Stantec and STH partners, I led a technology design piece as well as a future first-person experience and narrative development piece of work. So this is where those hybrid esquisses or design charrettes came into play, where we were working on designing a series of different options for things that we thought might address some of our means objectives. It's resulted in a number of designs, and you can see some of these outcomes, which when we render them up, all look really nice. But it can be hard to differentiate between these because they are so different, and I'll talk about that in the next section. The care process has just been published, but it's probably not as relevant for this audience. But the future first-person experience through speculative futures, I think, is something that architects should be doing more as a part of their design processes, and thinking of as a way of actually exploring as a creative act, not just as an explanation of their work. So speculative futures are called different things by different people. Sometimes it's called foresight engineering, sometimes future casting, sometimes visioning, design fictions, science fictioning, extrapolating. There's many different terms for these processes, but we followed Dunn and Raby's speculative futures model to really explore how a first-person experience of an architectural environment might look. So we took a whole lot of analysis from our workshop series, added some personas and phenotypes, which we developed with our clinicians, and then went through a series of iterations to describe these stories, which were then aligned back to our means objectives, those important things that we were trying to design for. We arrived at a series of stories that are told from a stroke survivor's perspective, as well as a series of stories that are told from a staff member's perspective. And then we used some illustration, animation, and video formats to turn these into a bit more of a narrative that gave people a sense of the temporal inhabitation of healthcare architecture, rather than just looking at planned sections and static elements. These were eventually taken into some technology workshops where we looked at a lot of the descriptors of how these environments were working and worked to define a series of technologies at different price points for how we would be able to achieve these things. All of these are available as resources from the NOVELL website. But I mentioned before about how we designed a series of different hospital environments based on the input of, we've got these 8 things that we want to design. There's a real challenge when we start trying to compare these things, because it can be very hard to compare one person's design with another design. If we think back to what I talked about briefly in terms of Professor McGilchrist's work, we are trying to find ways of evaluating our work that are based on a right brain or holistic reading rather than a left brain reductionist approach. But along the way, we decided we would actually try and do both. And the reason for this is because healthcare research and a lot of our partners are very familiar with guidelines for the quality of evidence. And the way that we define evidence for what constitutes good design is very different from the way that clinicians describe evidence for what is good practice in healthcare. So a lot of our evidence comes out of expert opinion, which is the lowest form of evidence and isn't really accepted in healthcare. Whereas they're working up to randomized control trials and then meta-analyses of a whole lot of randomized control trials, which is not something we can do in architecture because we can't build a series of hospitals, operate them, and compare them over time. It just isn't possible. So there are, as I said, different approaches to research, and it's a gross oversimplification to say it's either left brain or right brain because there is so much nuance in this. But essentially in this project, we went through a series of evaluation tools and techniques that were about controlling and isolating variables, so that reducing down to single variables and manipulating those. So Tianyi Yang and Michelle Shannon, their PhD projects both looked at controlling and isolating variables in the built environment to vary things like the view out the window, as you can see here, to evaluate people's response to those. And this work has really been picked up by health design group in the United States and has gained a lot of momentum around trying to quantify each particular element of the built environment. But what we wanted to do in our project was be able to compare something like this rehabilitation ward on the left here with this rehabilitation centre on the right. Now, if you're looking at these images, I know personally which rehab centre I would probably prefer to be in, and it's going to be this one on the right. But I can't tell you exactly which variables are guiding that decision. So we've worked with a statistician, Leonid Cherlov, to develop a process that allows us to consider each of these options essentially as bowls of soup. So our built environment, if we think of it as a bowl of soup, we can evaluate one bowl of soup against another bowl of soup, and we don't need to understand exactly how much garlic is in it or how long the onion's been sauteed for over high heat or how much salt's been added. Understanding the chemical breakdown and the nutritional facts of each bowl of soup won't tell us which bowl of soup is better. It will give us some kind of reading about that soup, but it's not going to help us compare designs together. So instead, defining what we value, so going back to those slides where I talked about defining those things that we value as those fundamental and means objectives, and then prioritizing which are most important, allows us to let people make comparisons between elements where there are huge numbers, uncountable numbers of variables changing between each set. So essentially, we have 4 different hospital designs that are completely different. And by getting people to evaluate against the values that we had defined in the project, we're able to make some conclusions. So I'll skip through this reasonably quickly because you can read more detail in any of our web documentation. But we looked at how we can use opinion surveys, questionnaires, behavior modeled neurophysiological measures in both 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, virtual reality or augmented reality and real world environments. To look at how we evaluate each of these things. So for maximizing outdoor and green spaces, putting people in virtual reality and getting them to rank different hospitals might have got this type of ranking. Then for maximizing sightlines and visibility, we did put people in virtual reality. But Tianyi Yang also wrote some Grasshopper scripts to conduct some analysis of floor plans, to do some ray tracing to understand what the visual connectivity between the different spaces would be. And so, as you can see, each of these are arriving at a different ranking of each of our designs. There's no consistency yet in this. So by going through a whole series of different evaluative tests and then based on each of these criteria, We then sent it across to our statistician, who conducted a very fancy multiple criteria decision analysis, but was able to give us some box plots and some idea of ranking based on how people were perceiving the environments that we'd created, based on being asked to consider just the legibility of the space, just the outdoor and green space, just the personal control over the space, just positive and stimulating, just sightlines and visibility, or just versatility, as well as an overall their impression of it. And you can see here we have 4 different ward types, one based on a standard hospital design, and then 3 other variations. Here with bedrooms, again, a standard baseline based on what we are building now, and then 3 other options that have been costed to be about the same cost. So we're trying to build evidence that will be accepted by healthcare, because we know that our perceptions as designers aren't always taken seriously if we can't provide evidence for the quality of what we're doing as well. So in summary, the novel method embraces complexity. It doesn't seek to isolate variables. It celebrates the fact that designers can hold all of these variables in their heads at once, and sees that as a key strength. We use a multi-stakeholder process to bring people together as a part of the design practice, acknowledging that no one person holds all the answers. We focus on values rather than gross floor areas, so defining what people value. Bring multiple methods together and look at how we can rank alternatives based on people's perception of how well they're going to meet predefined values, rather than using just a quantitative measure or just a quantitative test. As a strength, we think it's a really great way of facilitating step change thinking, really big changes in the way that we think about our healthcare environments. But it also gives us a structured approach to fall back on, so that we do have some evidence coming into this and that we can stand behind the findings that we are delivering. So to sum up, I'd like to give you 3 key takeaways, if you remember nothing else from this presentation. And these are specifically written for architecture, but I hope they are applicable whatever design discipline you are coming from. I think the early stages of this project taught us that a truly participant-centered engagement is not a design meeting that we schedule online via Zoom or in a meeting room at 2 o'clock on a Thursday. It is a much more complex form of engagement, where we are working with stakeholders at times and in places that work for them. We're also defining or designing our engagement to allow people to actually give us meaningful input. We're not asking people what they want, we're asking people what they're trying to achieve. Second point is that healthcare architecture is complex. Yes, designing a hospital is incredibly hard, but even harder than that is operating in this epistemological world that's defined by the scientific method. Because we are designers, we can think outside of a linear model of design. We can integrate huge amounts of complex information into our processes, not even necessarily knowing how we're doing it. And explaining that and building trust in our clinical colleagues can be really, really challenging and takes a lot of time. And then finally, whether it's provided for you or as a part of your own practice, defining objectives or a performance-based brief, so there's things that you're trying to achieve, can help us shift from a reductionist approach, where we are looking at, well, I need 3 square meters for the cleaner's store, or sorry, 10 square feet for the cleaner's store, and I need this amount of space for the clinical meeting room, to I want a space that makes people feel comfortable and like they're at home, or I want a space that makes people want to get out of bed and be active and interact with other people. And I think this can help us to revalue architectural practice and design practices as a part of the healthcare design process, and stop us from getting quite so squeezed out by the regulations, standards, and documents that we find in a lot of in Australia, it's the Australasian Health Facility Design Guidelines, which are as exciting as they sound. And I think these types of processes can help us push back a little bit against those and work with the people we're designing for, rather than working with an Excel spreadsheet. So I hope that's been thought-provoking or challenging for you in some way.